they sold their heritage for a pot of porridge. And he said they sold it for a price of a pickup. And he tried to get them to stand. He tried to get them to unite and say, no, you cannot do this to us. You know, these were 4 or 5 generational ranchers we're talking here. These were the same people that their forefathers, along with our forefathers, came out and carved a living out of this desert. That they bled and died and buried their forefathers on this land. And now they're literally being treated like they're renters. And the renter's saying, we're no longer going to rent this to you. And there's nothing you can do. Nothing. And so that's what happened. And it left 2 ranchers, my father and a man named Keith Ney. And they simply at that point said no. They said, no, you're not taking my ranch. You're not taking my heritage. You're not taking what I am going to pass on to my children. And they said no. Keith Ney, shortly after that, died of a heart attack. And I really think, in my personal opinion, that it became very stressful for him, and he wasn't very old. He was in his 60s. And that left my dad alone. But the interesting thing is, if you back up just a few, probably 10, 15 years before that, when you had all these ranchers still ranching in that area, and they could see that these regulations and these actions from the federal government were basically going to put them out of business, and they began to search for their rights. What rights did they have to be there? You know, they knew they had rights. They understood that these rights were established by prior appropriation and by beneficial use, and that they were there, they were documented, that they had followed all the state laws. They knew that all these things were happening. Go sit down, okay? Thank you. If you go sit down. Okay, she's not going to sit down. Yeah. And so the ranchers together began to study how are they going to defend their rights. And this was going on in southern Nevada, northern Nevada, other states as well. It was a big movement. They created a cattlemen's association, and they hired lawyers, and they began to really try to dig into these codes and regulations and loopholes, and how are they going to beat these federal agencies, in their own codes, and that's what they began to do. They began to do studies, in the southern Nevada area. Their excuse was the desert tortoise, and they said the desert tortoise and the cattle can't live together, and that the cattle were actually, destroying the habitat of the desert tortoise. Now, let me ask you, does that sound familiar? Okay. Now, all I'm going to say here sounds familiar. You just plug in different species and different studies, and it's the exact same thing. It happens over and over. It's the greatest scam that's ever, in my opinion, happened in America and maybe even the world. That they take an endangered species and get the public sympathy that we got to protect this species, and then they enforce their rules and regulations upon you and take your right away. And then we find out 20 years later that their actions actually destroyed the species. Actually destroyed the habitat of the species. And that the only thing that it did was put them in power and control. That's it. Sound familiar? Well, that's what was happening. But we didn't understand the game back then. Not near as clear as we understand it now. And so they were trying to fight. They did studies. They hired independent, scientists to come out and do a study, and what did the independent scientists find? That the desert tortoise relied upon the cattle for part of its habitat. And that where the cattle were, the desert tortoise count was higher. And where the cattle was not, the desert tortoise count was lower. And but when we presented this to the federal courts, you know what? The judge said, this is interesting, and actually became pretty interested in these studies because it was directly opposite of what the federal government's own studies were. Their studies were showing that, that they were contaminating the water and that it was causing a disease for the desert tortoise, and goes on and on. It was exactly opposite of what our independent studies were showing. And so the judge began to kind of, look at both of them. And then the attorneys for the Bureau of Land Management said, Your Honor, I want to show you something. And he brings up an act of Congress or something in their codes. I don't remember what it was. And basically it said that the federal agent that's involved in the studies and all gets to choose what study is used in the court. And the judge doesn't get to decide, and it really doesn't matter if we did independent studies. And so in the reality, what are they saying? That the truth doesn't matter. And that no matter what they do, they're right. And so the judge says, yeah, that is what the law says. I guess you're right, so let's move forward. And that's what we experience time and time again. Knowing that it was unjust, knowing that it was incorrect. And then later, just kind of to emphasize, or to end this little story about the desert tortoise, later, Bureau of Land Management whistleblower who got disgruntled because of something that happened inside the agency, he revealed that the Bureau of Land Management had 55-gallon barrels clear full of these 3-inch tortoise shells. And they had holes in the back, the top of them. And they were from the ravens. And that is actually what was causing the desert tortoise count to drop in the population. And that the Bureau of Land Management knew it the entire time that they were running these ranchers off their heritage. And they were using it in the courts. They knew that it was the ravens that were causing and destruction among the population of the desert tortoise. And yet they continued with the narrative that it was the cattle. So this is what I grew up with. And my dad at some point finally said, no, you're not taking my ranch. And then he said, hell no. He did. He fired the Bureau of Land Management. He says, you're a management company. You're a management entity, I guess, to say. And I'm not going to hire you and pay you to manage me out of my business. And he said, no. And of course, they say, you can't say no to us. And they tried to drag him into court. And my dad ignored him. And he ignored him primarily for 20 years.
Wow, what an amazing story so far, huh, guys? Isn't that, it reminds me of a situation that I had gone through, when you ignore the people that are against you or whatever, it just seems to fuel the fire. These individuals don't like to be ignored. They like to be the center of attention. They want their way. There's this attitude of entitlement, and it is very prominent in the federal government agencies because they've gotten what they've wanted for so long that they continue to persist until they do get what they want. So I will upload the continuation of this video. You guys stay tuned.